there, and welcome back. This time, we're talking about the Adventurer token and the series of cards based around it. We'll of course also talk about the Adventure engine, including the types of decks it worked really well in, and how it might come back into popularity, but there are also a lot of other cards that this series has to offer. So we'll take a look at how they operate as a deck and try to determine whether or not it can actually stand on its own as a competent strategy, or if the engine really is the best that these cards could ever hope to offer. And real quick before we get started, I hope it's obvious that these videos are pretty high effort, so if you like this video and want to see more of these, I would really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe, and maybe even let me know what you think down in the comments. Thanks for watching, now let's get going. Premiering in the Grand Creators and getting support in both Dimension Force and Darkwing Blast, this series of cards was a massive hit right off the bat. Thematically, the series centers around a classic fantasy adventuring party, where you, the duelist, play the role of the party leader in the form of the Adventurer token itself. You also have the other party members, including the mage, the tank, the whatever this is. Oh, that's the healer. You also have the places you go, the items you'll discover, and the new allies you'll make along the way, some of whom may even betray you. The way this plays out mechanically is we have a few spells that can create the Adventurer token for us, a bunch of monsters that can summon themselves to join their leader on the battlefield, a few of which can even enter the fray alone, multiple field and equip spells, a couple traps showing off our other party members' abilities, and finally, a continuous spell representing the party all being together, which can protect our token in battle and generate advantage by getting access to allies and arms from the deck. And with that, we're ready to jump into the cards. To organize this, we'll actually start with the token itself and the spells that summon it, since the entire strategy is going to revolve around it. The Adventurer token is a level 4 Earth Fairy with both an attack and defense of 2000. The original way to summon the token, and for nearly 9 months after release the only way, is Rite of Aramesir. This is a normal spell that says if you don't already control an Adventurer token, special summon one. Then, if you don't control a Fateful Adventure, you can place one from your deck face up in your spell and trap zone. Also, this card comes with the restriction that you cannot activate the effects of monsters on the field the turn you activate it, except for special summoned monsters. So basically no effects of either normal or flip summoned monsters. And of course, this is a hard once per turn. Now we do have one more way to summon the Adventurer token, but first let's take a look at what that Fateful Adventure has in store for us to get a better idea of how much value we're really getting from Rite of Aramesir. Fateful Adventure is a continuous spell, whose first effect says that once per turn, the first time a monster you control equipped with an equip spell would be destroyed by battle, it isn't destroyed. The remaining effects are all hard once per turns. First, during the main phase, you can add one monster that mentioned Adventurer token from your deck to your hand, then send one card from your hand to the graveyard. And finally, if a monster or monsters is normal or special summoned, you can take one equip spell that mentions Adventurer token from your deck and either add it to your hand or equip it to an Adventurer token you control. This card is an advantage machine. It's incredible that the card that summons our token also gets us to something like this. It doesn't just put a token out and restrict us, it also really gets the game plan going. And in a deck built around the Adventurer token, that discard might not even be that big of a deal if we open one of the equip spells, since as we'll see later, each of them can recur themselves from the graveyard when they're sent there. And the battle protection is kind of a neat little afterthought. It's nice that Rite places this face up from the deck so it can't be hit by Ash Blossom, but this card can, so you should still keep that in mind. The biggest thing to look out for though is when Ghost Ogre is in the meta. With Ash, you can still at least activate the other search effect that wasn't negated, but since Fateful Adventure is a continuous spell, it has to remain face up on the field to properly resolve. So if it gets hit with Ghost Ogre, you won't even get the search effect that was activated. And now for the final way we'll be getting to the battlefield, we have Curse of Aramesir. This is also a continuous spell, and it says during your main phase, you can summon an Adventurer token, but you can summon it to either field, and then you have to send a card from your hand to the graveyard. This time though, we have an even harsher restriction stating that we cannot special summon monsters the turn we activate this effect, except for Adventurer tokens and monsters that mention the Adventurer token. And finally, if a monster you control is destroyed by battle or card effect, you can special summon an Adventurer token to either field. And of course, both of these effects are hard once per turn. So this one is more lenient on the board state when we want to summon an Adventurer token, and it can do it twice each turn instead of just once ever, but then it has a much more restrictive condition on our summoning and doesn't even generate more advantage like Rite does. As for why you'd want to give your opponent a token, there is a small use case for it within the series that we'll talk about in a bit. It's not a fantastic play or anything, just a small situation that might come up every once in a while, or it could even be a funny game plan to build your deck around. Other than that, there are some decks that want an open field to start their plays, but you're giving up an important piece of your own board to do that when they might just have a way to get rid of it anyway. There might be other strategies that can take advantage of the opponent having a monster on turn 1, but since this card locks you into just Adventurer token cards, you'll have to find a way to pull that off without using any other monsters. If you have any good uses for this effect, go ahead and let me know in the comments. And for what it's worth, this card brings the maximum number of Adventurer tokens we can summon in a single turn up to 3, assuming you can activate Rite, then Curse, then get one of your monsters destroyed to activate Curse again. Alright, now that we know how we get to the fight, let's take a look at who we'll be fighting alongside. Water Enchantress of the Temple is a level 3 water spellcaster with 1500 attack and 1200 defense. And it says that if you control an Adventurer token, you can special summon it from your hand. The second and most important effect says that you can banish this card from your hand or graveyard to add one Rite of Aramesir from your deck or graveyard to your hand. And finally, if you control an Adventurer token, you can place one field spell that mentions the Adventurer token from your deck face up in your field zone. And of course, everything is a hard once per turn. The last effect is useless in the Adventure engine because you won't be playing any of the field spells, but in a deck built around the Adventurer token, where you are playing the field spells, you get a nice little bonus for opening removing certain redundant cards. Let's say you open 2 Water Enchantress. You can use one to get Rite of Armaseer, then after using Rite, you can special summon the other one and use its effect to grab a field spell, so opening 2 of them wasn't a total waste. Another thing you can do in addition to this is before firing off the first Water Enchantress, you can normal summon it, then link it off for something like Artemis, then use the Water Enchantress effect from the grave. Water Enchantress still ends up banished, Rite still ends up in your hand, but now, at the cost of your normal summon, you have an extra body left over to go right into a generic link too, at which point you would have another Water Enchantress engrave her follow up on your next turn. Of course, you can do all this in the Adventure Engine too, you just don't get the extra advantage of searching a field spell, so depending on the situation, it could actually be better to hold on to the second Water Enchantress in hand and using it for the discard off of Fateful Adventure or something like that. Also, if you open 1 Water Enchantress and 1 Rite, be sure to use the Water Enchantress first, however you plan to do it, because remember, Rite can't be ashed, but Fateful Adventure can, and so can Water Enchantress, so it works as excellent ash bait. Water Enchantress is pretty clearly the second most important card in the series, because it gets us immediate access to the number 1 most important card. Having extra ways to get to a token on board is essential to making these cards work, both as an engine and a deck, because almost every payoff that this series has requires an adventurer token to be on the field to activate. We'll finish off the rest of the monsters now, and remaining are 2 level 4s and 2 level 7s. The level 4s share the same special summon effect as Water Enchantress, that if you control an adventurer token, you can special summon them from your hand, and the level 7s share the much better effect that during the main phase, if you control an adventurer token or if you control no monsters, you can special summon them from your hand as a quick effect. Magicor, Warrior of the Relics, is a level 4 fire warrior with 2300 attack and 1000 defense, and it cannot attack unless you control an adventurer token. Also, at the end of the battle phase, if your monster that mentions adventurer token battled, you can set a trap that mentions adventurer token directly from your deck. Wandering Griffin Rider is a level 7 winged beast with 2000 attack and 2800 defense, and does a hard once per turn. When a card or effect is activated, while you control an adventurer token, you can quick effect shuffle this card into the deck, and if you do that, negate that activation, and if you do that, destroy that card. Sadly, it doesn't shuffle itself back as cost, so it can't work around things like skill drain, but it is still one of the best cards in the series. Illegal Knight is a dark fiend with both an attack and defense of 2000, and it has the effect that if you control an adventurer token, you can quick effect target up to 2 cards your opponent controls, then give control of this card to your opponent and return the targeted cards to the hand. Notably, that says cards, not monsters, or even face-up cards, just any 2 cards your opponent controls, giving this card a nice bit of versatility. And finally, we have Celestial Apparatus Tesea, a light fairy with 1000 attack and defense. This monster lets you reveal 1 card in your hand that mentions the adventurer token, to add 1 spell that mentions the adventurer token from your deck to your hand, except for a normal spell. So currently, this card can grab any of your spells except for Rite of Armaseer. But this effect comes with the same restriction as Curse of Armateer. That is, you cannot special summon monsters the turn you activate it, except for the adventurer token and monsters that mention it. Now, I suppose that effect can be nice in the case where you open all the monsters you'd want to search with Fateful Adventure, then you can grab this to basically turn that monster search into another spell search, but the restriction is still super harsh, and it means you have to pick what you want to use this card for. It can be either an easy body for an extra deck play, or it can get you another spell, but not both. And that's it for our party lineup, so now let's take a look at what kind of equipment we're working with. Notably, they all share 3 effects. Each of them can only be equipped to a monster you control. You can only control 1 of each of them, and the best effect, on a hard once per turn, if they're sent to the graveyard, you can target 1 adventurer token you control and equip them to it. This doesn't totally fix the problems that equip spells generally have with generating advantage, but it does go a long way to mitigate how bad they are at maintaining it. First up is Dracoback the Rideable Dragon, and while this card is equipped to a non-effect monster, you can target 1 card your opponent controls and return it to the hand. You don't even need to sacrifice this card like some of the other good equipped spell effects in the game, so every turn it stays around on the field, you can do it again. But realize it's not a quick effect, so you can only do it on your turns. A fun little synergy, if you absolutely need to get rid of 2 of your opponent's cards without giving them a free monster, you can use Illegal Knight, then use Dracoback to bounce it back to your own hand. Now at this point we have 4 spells left, 2 equipped spells and 2 field spells, and they come paired up. Thematically, these are the locations the party ventures into and the items found there. So each field spell will grant some sort of bonus effect for monsters equipped with their respective equipped spells. They also have a soft once per turn second effect, regardless of the equipped spells, that triggers when your adventurer token destroys a monster by battle, and a third effect to, during your main phase, let you search out a different field spell that mentions the adventurer token if that second effect was activated that turn. Tunnel the Noble Arms of Light is what happens when the power of teamwork and friendship gets channeled into the star's signature weapon. The equipped monster gains 500 attack for each unique monster you control that mentions the adventurer token. So if you have a full board including a token, that would be an increase of 2000 attack. Equipping it to your token would bring its attack all the way up to 4000. This sword can be found in Zaralam the Dark Palace. This field spell says that while you control a monster equipped with Tunnel, your opponent cannot activate cards or effects during during the battle phase. Also, once per turn when your adventurer token destroys a monster by battle, you can inflict a damage to your opponent equal to the destroyed monster's original attack. The burn can be nice, especially with how high our token's attack can get with Dunnel, but battle phase stuff is generally not that great. And the final equip spell is Starlit Papillon, and it basically does the opposite of Dunnel. Instead of one of your monsters gaining 500 attack, all of your opponent's monsters lose 500 attack for each unique monster you control that mentions the adventurer token. And just like Dunnel, on a board consisting of the token and 4 monsters that mention it, Papillon would decrease all your opponent's monsters' attacks by 2,000. And finally, this little creature hails from the Forest of Lost Flowers. And while we're here, monsters you control equipped with Papillon are unaffected by your opponent's activated effects. And once per turn, when your adventurer token destroys a monster by battle, you can draw a card. So clearly, between the blanket protection and the draw power, Forest is the better of the 2 field spells by far. But Zarlam is the way I mentioned earlier, that we can actually get use out of Curse's effect to give the opponent a token. You can recycle Griffin, Illegal Knight, and Draco back each turn to prevent your opponent from building a board, then use Curse to give them a token, then crash into it with your own token, and then Zarlam will deal 2k in burn damage. As long as you still have Draco back equipped to your token, Fateful Adventure will stop it from being destroyed by this battle. Obviously, the other equip spells and more monsters would get you more damage in a turn, with Papillon even being able to set the other token's attack all the way down to 0, but even without those, you would still be able to burn your opponent out over 4 turns. Of course, by modern standards, this is not at all a good strategy, but it is one way I saw within the series to take advantage of that side of Curse's effect. Oh, and Zarlam does also stop effects during your opponent's battle phase, so I guess if like War Rocks ever got good, you know where to look. And finally, we have 2 traps. Breath of Resurrection says that if you control an adventurer token, special summon up to 2 monsters from your hand and or graveyard with different names, but they're banished when they leave the field. Then, you can equip one equip spell that mentions the adventurer token from your hand or graveyard to a monster you control. You can only activate 1 Breath of Resurrection per turn. Notice that unlike the equip spell you grab, the monsters you summon don't have to mention the adventurer token, so as long as there isn't some other restriction stopping it, you can summon any monster. This is another one of the cards that has like a niche little synergy with Illegal Knight, where if it gets stuck on your opponent's board, you can just run it over in battle, and then when you get the chance, bring it back with this. And finally, we have Thunder Discharge, which says if you control an adventurer token, you can target 1 monster you control equipped with an equip spell that mentions the adventurer token, and destroy as many monsters your opponent controls as possible with an attack less than or equal to that monster. Then you can equip 1 equip spell that mentions the adventurer token from your hand or graveyard to a monster you control, and you can only activate 1 per turn. Going first, this is potentially a huge interruption, especially with how much attack our monsters can gain from Dunnel, and how much attack our opponent's monsters all lose from Papillon. What is effectively an instant speed Raigeki, if it's done at the right time, can be turn-ending against a lot of different decks. Of course, you do always still need to be mindful of what the opponent is playing and any possible floating effects they might have. Looking at these 2 traps, they're actually not half bad. The token requirement, combined with the fact that you really want to activate them at specific times, is pretty rough, but the effects you get from them are really good. However, the astute viewer may have noticed something along the way. The only way in series to search these traps is with Magikor's Battle Phase effect. Looking back, all the other searchers grab either like non-normal spells, equip spells, or monsters that mention the adventurer token. It's actually impossible within the series to search these traps on your first turn going first, which is a huge disappointment. It puts that last trap in kind of a funny position of being a trap that's actually better going second, not because it's good at that, but because that's the only way of getting consistent access to it. Of course, going second, you'd always much rather have something like Lightning Storm that can be used proactively, instead of something you have to wait until the 3rd turn for. It's actually not quite as bad at going second as other similar cards are, since the series does have a lot of ways of returning your opponent's cards to the hand, so you could spend your turn dismantling their board, attack with Magikor to set this, use it to interrupt their attempt to rebuild their board, and then on your next turn, close out the game. That's not to say that that's some sort of great strategy, just that it's not quite as bad as it might look at first. And for now, that's the whole series. So what did we learn from all that? Well, it looks like the Adventurer Token series operates as a fairly straightforward control strategy with decent damage output and board breaking potential, and a pretty interesting concept at the center. Basing a strategy around putting equip spells on normal monsters to gain powerful effects sounds super cool as a concept, but in practice would normally just be combining 2 of the worst card types in the game. But if you replace the normal monster bricks in that idea with spells that summon tokens, while also generating more advantage, then you've replaced the worst of your mechanics with something actually really good. And with equips that float back once per turn, you softened one of their biggest weaknesses too. The deck does seem a little bit conflicted though. On one hand, you have a battle phase oriented equip spell strategy that has great access to its equip spells and really good board spamming abilities for a potential OTK. The other half is a control strategy that in theory should be there to protect the battle phase stuff, but in reality, you only really get 1 monster search each turn, and the traps are hard to access. The only way you can even search one of those is by waiting until the end of the battle phase, so you really aren't setting up a ton of control options without hard drawing them. But in a single turn, the series does have very good consistent access to at least one of those control options and one of the board breakers, and it doesn't take that many of the cards we talked about to do that, so the series is incredibly potent when paired with other decks. Which brings us to the Adventure Engine. So before we keep talking about the series as a whole, let's take a minute to talk about what the engine is, the types of decks it was best in, why it's fallen off lately, and what might bring it back into fashion. So this is how it generally plays. It consists consists of 3 Water Enchantress, 3 Rite of Armiseer, 1 Griffin, 1 Dracoback, and 1 Fateful Adventure. And technically, if you have other uses for it, you could throw in a Foolish Burial, because Water Enchantress can also activate its effect from the graveyard. To start your turn, you'll activate either Rite or Water Enchantress, whichever one you drew, to get to your token in Fateful Adventure. Then use Fateful to grab Griffin and pitch any other card from your hand, then special summon Griffin, triggering Fateful to grab Dracoback and equip it to the token. It's a very straightforward play, and starting from just a single card plus a discard, you now have an Omni Negate, and if you're going second or against a strategy that can put out a body on your turn, you also have the bounce. I'll also point out that you don't have to activate Fateful Adventure immediately, so if you have something else in hand to summon without committing too much before getting Griffin out, go for it, and then you can trigger Fateful Adventure's Equip Spell Search first. Make sure to add Dracoback to hand instead of equipping it from the deck. Then when you search Griffin, you can pitch the Dracoback, it will jump right onto the field equipping to your token, getting you the Griffin basically for free. And since the summon that triggers Fateful Adventure doesn't have to happen on your field, this is a great combo with something like a Kaiju, because remember those effects aren't once per turn. So if you're able to get this far despite your opponent having an established board already, you can use a Kaiju to trigger Fateful Adventure to get to Dracoback, use the Dracoback to return the Kaiju to your hand, and then summon it again. So the engine is pretty obviously great, and there were 2 types of decks that really used this engine the best. The first was something like Prank Kids. This was already a very strong, consistent combo deck, but with very clear weaknesses. The way their combo gets going is by normal summoning one of their main deck monsters, then linking it off for their powerful link 1. If that monster's graveyard effect is negated, it can be catastrophic. So being able to insulate that with an Omni Negate, or even just if the opponent uses their interaction to stop the Adventurer cards, leaving you wide open for the Prank Kids combos, that is a huge boost to the deck's consistency. The other big reason that these 2 sets of cards paired really well together is that Prank Kids never needed an effective or normal summon monster. All of their main deck monsters only have effects in the graveyard, so it didn't even need to make concessions to work around the biggest drawback of the engine, unlike something like, say, Branded would have at the time. So to summarize it, the first type of deck that really used the Adventure engine the best was just any deck that needed to insulate their plays from interruption, and huge bonus points if they never needed the effect of a normal summoned monster anyway. The second type of deck is one that could take advantage of the fact that the engine gets you multiple free bodies on board. You might have heard these referred to as pile decks, and they're primarily synchro strategies that were just full of all the good synchro stuff at the time. Between the token and Griffin, that's 11 free levels on board for synchro plays. Another synergy is the fact that the Tenyi cards were really popular in synchro strategies at the time, and the token being a normal monster made the secondary effects of all the main deck Tenyi monsters live. Also going second, they could easily get to Yazi Evil of the Yangzing, who could special summon Sword Soul of Moye from the deck, getting around what would normally be the only normal summoned monster effect in a standard Sword Soul deck. The unlimiting of Emergency Teleport combined with the release of the Punk archetype helped out this strategy a ton too. Also, these decks could manage to still be consistent at 60 cards, which is nice because the engine has a bunch of cards that you never want to draw. You really only want to open either a Water Enchantress or a Rite, and then use those to search everything else. And playing 60 cards, while it does make it less likely that you see any of the cards, does also lower the risk of opening cards that you don't want to. So, if the engine is so good, why isn't it played as much anymore? Well, there are 2 parts to that answer. The first is the ban list. The banning of Prank Kids Meow Meow Mew basically killed that archetype, and that was really the best deck of the first type that was taking full advantage of the engine. As for the second type, the banning of both Hulk and Auroradon was a pretty big blow to synchro strategies in general. The second reason is just general power creep. If we look at the decks that are popular right now, those synchro strategies just really can't compete with the hyper consistency of things like Tearlaments, and adding the engine to any other new strategy just doesn't really offer enough. One Omni Negate isn't really going to do much against the current decks, though there is a chance it could come back in the future. We might get a new synchro strategy that doesn't need a normal summon, or the series could get another equip spell or monster that are maybe situationally a lot better than Dracoback and Griffin. As time goes on, we will always get more decks that don't need a normal summon, so maybe one day one of those works really well with it. The meta could also shift towards decks that just have very clear choke points that need protecting. Really, any one of those would make the engine at least a little bit more enticing to play. In fact, we have a specific example coming up soon. After the core set Photon Hypernova, the rank 7 Kashtira archetype is getting a very powerful second wave of support. The engine will stop you from using the effect of a monster you normal summon with Kashtira Birth, but all things considered, that's not really the biggest downside, and if you absolutely need that monster's effect, you can use it as Xyz material for a monster with a detach effect, then detach this monster so it goes to the graveyard, then use Birth's other effect to special summon it from the graveyard, and now you can use that monster's effect. The archetype does also get a level 4 monster with a very powerful effect that can activate the turn it's summoned, but that monster can also special summon itself if you have another Kashtira on board. And since it's a rank 7 archetype, having, say, Illegal Knight can even help you get to an extra deck Kashtira monster, making that new monster special summon effect alive, so you can still extend further even under rights restriction. This archetype can also be weak to blanket removal like Dark Hole and Raigeki, so being able to put up an easy Omni Negate is really nice, especially when you can just discard one of their monsters for Fateful Adventure, then special summon it right back with Kashtira Birth. This actually puts it a little bit into each of our 2 categories that we talked about earlier, which is why it looks like it might turn out to be a pretty good combination. As for how strong it'll turn out to be relative to the meta, only time will tell. Alright, now that we've seen all the cards and talked about the engine, it's time we look at what types of cards from outside the series we would want to include in a deck built around the Adventurer token. First of all, we've already talked about it a little bit, but Foolish Burial. Getting to Rite on turn 1 is super important, and this is just another card that gets you there. Foolish Burial Goods might seem like a good idea at first, Forest, since it triggers the equip spells to hop onto the field, but honestly we already have so much access to those, it might not even be necessary. Also, if you want easier access to Forest without having to play Zar Alam, then Terraforming in Metaverse might be nice. And since the draw effect on Forest is only a soft once per turn, you could even use Metaverse in the battle phase to replace Forest with another one, then destroy another monster, and get another draw. Also, since we don't have an inherent need for the extra deck, we can get a lot of draw power out of Pot of Extravagance. We already noted that half the series wants to play like a control strategy, so really any of the countless good generic control cards would be a good idea. In particular, since we just talked about not needing a ton of space in the extra deck, we have a lot of room left over for targets for Dogmatic Punishment. This will allow us to send cards like Garura, Entis, and Mirologic Aggregator to get double the value. Then when we're going second, we can side this out for Ultimate Slayer and take advantage of the exact same extra deck monsters, just making sure we have a good variety of the types of extra deck monsters to make sure we're ready for all sorts of matchups. We have 2 each of easy to summon level 4s and level 7s, so maybe a couple meta-dependent Xyz monsters like Abyss Dweller. And of course with an Xyz monster, it can always be a good idea to bring along Zeus. Along similar lines, any number of good generic low-rating Link monsters could help too. A card like Armory Call might seem okay at first, like if we have Forest on board and something happens to our Papillon, this could get us another one to reinstate our protection, but that's really all it would be good for, outside of maybe some battle phase shenanigans. I think a slightly better alternative would be something like Hidden Armory, because it allows us to proactively search out an equip spell on our own turn. And especially if we're playing equip spells from outside the series, it would be really nice to have a way to search those too. The series obviously isn't a mill strategy by any means, but between Water Enchantress and all of our equip spells, we do have a lot of good graveyard effects, so this card's cost could actually just turn it into a +1, and the restriction that you can't normal summon or set the turn you activate this card is only a moderately worse version of the restriction we're already playing around. In fact, within the series, there really isn't much of a reason to be normal summoning anyway. Something the series is sorely missing is its own boss monster, but since it's playing equip spells and has pretty good access to them, one really good option would be Immortal Phoenix Gearfried, giving the deck another monster negate and a fantastic form of removal. For more control options, you could play a Bamboo Sword package. This would offer you the ability to make your opponent skip their draw phase and main phase entirely, plus a Pot of Greed, but all of that is pretty reliant on drawing unsearchable non-equipped spells, so it's not super reliable. As far as floodgates go, there can be only one. It's an insane floodgate, and almost all of our monsters are different attributes. The only one you can't use with it is Tisea, but that's kind of also the worst one, so oh well. The series can also play well with Dimension Shifter. The cards can pretty much do everything they need to under Shifter's effect. It does turn off the built-in recursion on your equip spells, but honestly Shifter's going to be a way bigger inconvenience for pretty much any other deck that isn't already playing it. Release Restraint Wave was so close to being a good card for the series, the cost is really nothing because your equip spell will just come back, and then you would get to destroy all of your opponent's face-down back row cards. The problem is they have to be face down. If you were facing some kind of deck that was only battle traps, then this would be perfect. The problem is pretty much any good back row cards can just be changed to this. You might be putting them in a position to activate all their cards at a suboptimal time, but that's kind of the best you can realistically hope for with this. If you're looking to mix this series to make a combo deck, Infernoble Knight Renaud could be a good place to start. Whenever it's special summoned, it can recur an equip spell, and if it's special summoned by its own effect, it becomes a tuner, so you have access to the great pool of level 8 synchros, and the okay pool of level 5 synchros. If you're looking for a combo to start your plays after activating right, consider this. If you have a way to get to both Renaud and Magicore, special summon Magicore, then Renaud, making sure to do what we talked about earlier, and use the Fateful Adventure effect to add Draco back to hand. Then, using Fateful Adventure, search out Griffin and pitch the Draco back, to then equip it to the token from the graveyard. Use the Warriors to make Isolde, and then on summon grab something like Immortal Phoenix Gearfried. Then use Isolde's other effect to dump the 2 remaining Adventurer token equip spells, and summon Secret 6 Samurai Genba from the deck, getting you access to the level 6 and 9 synchro pools, and also getting our last 2 Adventurer token equip spells equipped to our token. That alone obviously isn't like a good end board, but it can be a good way to start your plays and get access to all 3 of your in-series equips. That play alone, starting with a way to get to each right Magicore and Renaud, is a +6 if you include the Adventurer token, but obviously it's a lot worse if you have to use Fateful Adventure to search Magicore instead of Griffin, so we can help boost that consistency by playing cards like Reinforcement of the Army and Infernoble Arms Durandal, and maybe even Heritage of the Chalice, which can either search Renaud or Durandal, which can then grab either Renaud or Magicore. Plus, if you also have a way to get to Breath of Resurrection, then you can summon that gear feed from your hand on your opponent's turn for an extra monster negate. This makes things like Trap Trick a potentially even more appealing option for the deck, but be careful because between Fateful Adventure and the equips, this play is already using 4 of the back row slots, so if you're going to put something in that 5th one, make sure to choose wisely. As a variation on this, if you don't need to search Griffin, you can instead search Water Enchantress, then special summon it, and of course use its effect to search Forest so our token with Papillon can be protected. Then between Isolde, Genba, and Water Enchantress, we have enough material for a 2400 attack Appaloosa. Also, if you have more equip spells in your deck, you can summon something like Infernoble Knight Oliver and get access all the way up to the level 11 synchro pool. But remember, the equip spells that Isolde dumps from the deck have to have different names, and if you start playing too many equip spells, you're just going to turn your deck into a brick fest. Although if you are going to add more and you're going to lean a bit into the Fire Warrior combo type stuff, adding a Phoenix Blade and Different Dimension Reincarnation can be a great idea. Once in rotation, they actually make a really good resource loop, where you use the Phoenix Blade that was sent to the graveyard by Isolde to banish some warriors to add it back back to your hand, then you discard it as cost for DDR to summon back one of those banished monsters. Then every time you come across another DDR, do it again. Also along those lines, if you find your way into the level 9 synchro pool, then Power Tool Braver Dragon is a fantastic card in an equip spell deck. So is Infernoble Knight Emperor Charles, and this series has a ton of ways to trigger its destruction effect on the opponent's turn. Now our low level monsters don't really do too much on the field, especially on the opponent's turn, so using them for extra deck plays really isn't that big of a deal, but using our level 7s as material can feel like a huge waste. We can somewhat alleviate that feeling if we can find a way to get good access to Breath of Resurrection. This card just has so much potential to return a ton of value. If you're doing those combos we just described and end up with Griffin in the graveyard and Immortal Phoenix Gearfried in hand, this one trap becomes 2 negates on board. We've already mentioned using Trap Trick as a way to get more access to it, but another potential way is the upcoming Triple Tactic Tasking. This is a card coming out in Photon Hypernova, and it's very similar to Triple Tactic's talent, except with this card you can set any normal spell or trap from your deck to the field. You could also add it to hand if your opponent controls a monster. An okay going second play to get access to it will be to do everything we talked about before in the combo, up to using Isolde's effect. Then use Isolde to send 4 equip spells to summon a second Magic-Core. In this case you would use Fateful Adventure to search Illegal Knight, and then use Draco back and Illegal Knight to dismantle as much of their board as possible. Then use your token to run over your own Illegal Knight, and hopefully also use Magic-Core to get some damage out too. Then at the end of the battle phase, use Magic-Core's effect to set Breath of Resurrection, and flip it in your opponent's draw phase to bring out the Gearfried from hand and the Illegal Knight from grave. This is obviously assuming a lot, in particular that you're even able to get this far into a combo going second, but it does show us that it's actually pretty nice that Illegal Knight is a board breaker that leaves your opponent with a monster, especially one with pretty low attack, because it does work to hurt your opponent a lot while still leaving you a way to proc Magic-Core's effect. It might not be the most likely play to get through, but it's good to be aware of this type of play in case the opportunity ever presents itself. Alright, here's this episode's silly strategy that'll never work, but pulling it off would earn you your seat in Valhalla. So at least according to the ruling page on Wikipedia, the equip spell Moon Mirror Shield, which sets your monster's attack to exactly 100 more than your opponent's monster's attack during damage calculation only, would actually return Apollousa's attack to what it was summoned with after damage calculation, effectively just replenishing all of your negates. So you could play a very silly Apollousa beatdown, where you play the combo we talked about, have Isolde send just Moon Mirror Shield to the graveyard to summon Renaud, on summon Renaud effect to add Moon Mirror Shield to hand, replace your token with a Link Spider, and then you have a 3 material Apollousa with Moon Mirror Shield. Even better if you can get another monster on board before making the Link Spider, because then you'll have a 4 material Apollousa, and if you need to, you can even use Curse to give your opponent tokens for you to run over to keep replenishing your negates. Although obviously you're only doing at most 100 damage per attack, so realistically the game isn't going to end until your opponent just gets frustrated and leaves. You can maybe speed it up by adding Zaralam and Dunnel, then by just running over tokens you would burn them out over 4 turns. There are a million different ways to play these cards as a strategy. It's fairly generic, provides a lot of easy resources, and it can take up as little space in the deck as just the adventure engine, or as much as being the entire deck. You can turn it into a combo deck, you can lean more into a pure control variant, you can go full on token beatdown, or Zaralam Curse Burn. The ideas we've covered so far are really just a handful of things that came to mind when I was writing this. I'm sure there's an even better version of the deck out there. Alright, now that we've covered it all, let's go ahead and summarize what we've talked about, starting with the strengths. The first and most obvious one is the adventure engine. Even when you're basing your whole deck around the token, you of course still have access to this incredibly powerful toolbox. Also, the 2 level 7s have genuinely very good control effects, and for a strategy that uses equip spells, you do have a ton of access to them. Both of the traps, plus Fateful Adventure, plus their floating back once per turn, can make them pretty difficult to get rid of. Of course, the other way to get rid of equip spells is to get rid of the monsters they're equipped to, but a lot of the cards in the series work together to make it really hard to run over the token in battle, and then one of those equips combined with a field spell makes your token completely unaffected by card effects. All of that together combines into some pretty decent protection for both your token and your equip spells. Also, the relative genericness of the series leads it to pair really well with a lot of different decks. They're the kind of cards that, at least for the foreseeable future, it's always going to be worth keeping them in the back of your mind whenever you're looking into a new strategy or new set of cards that release, because there's a decent chance it could make use of these cards in at least some way. And for the series as a whole, that's pretty much it. You have the engine, of course, and outside of that, you have some nice control options, some decent protection for your most important card, and monsters that jump out of the hand pretty easy as long as you have that token. So now let's talk about the weaknesses. And as I kind of just alluded to with that last strength, what I think is by far the biggest weakness when trying to play this series as like a whole dedicated deck around the token is, what are you really doing if you can't get to Rite of Aramesir? This series is full of cards that are just completely dead without the token. You just can't even activate their effects if the token isn't on board. If we're playing Called by the Grave, we do technically have like 7 ways of getting to it in the first turn, but so many other decks these days are able to do at least something when they brick. But basically all of these cards are just dead. Like in that case, the best you can really do is just special summon a Griffin to an empty field and then pass. We do have Curse of Aramesir, and it can help a little bit, but is it really a good card? It's obviously a card that's built to help the series exist as a standalone deck, since it gives us more ways to get to the token, and then just completely locks you into the series. But that restriction is incredibly harsh, so we have to really determine if it's actually going to be worth it. And unfortunately, I don't really think it is. And it's because of what we talked about earlier. Curse does get you a token, but it doesn't get you any more advantage like Rite does. What I see as really the best case scenario with Curse, of course assuming you didn't already open Rite of Aramesir Armaseer, in which case you don't need Curse at all, you don't want it in your hand, is if you open both Curse and Tisea. Then you can normal summon Tisea, reveal Curse, search Fateful Adventure, and then activate both Fateful Adventure and Curse, and go from there. That does somewhat mimic opening Rite, but now the new question is exactly what do we do from there? We've been completely locked into the series, so from there, the best we could possibly hope for is to get a couple of our other monsters on board, and we only really have 2 of those that are worth putting up going first. The level 7s act as interruption, but the level 4s and the level 3 don't do anything on the opponent's turn. If we're going second, we could technically search Magicore, and then go to battle phase, and hopefully we're able to run over something to get to one of our traps. But the case where we're going second, open exactly Curse and Tisea, and no way to get to Rite, and our opponent just has no interruption to stop any of that, is basically never going to happen. Curse does also have that second effect to get you a new token whenever one of your monsters is destroyed, and that can be nice in some situations, but for the most part, it's really just a consolation prize. Getting a new token does make sure your other effects are still live, but really, how did your token get destroyed in the first place if both your Omni Negate and your Bounce are still on board? It's not like this could rebuild your board or anything. If you have a token with the equip spells on it, and then that token gets destroyed, this effect to get a new token has to activate in the same chain that the equip spell effects to bring themselves back would, but at that time, you don't have a token, so the equip spells never have a valid activation window for them to come back, so all you get is the token. And while having a 2k body to absorb some damage can be nice, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! If you're already down that much, even if the token helps you last another turn, it probably won't last much longer than that. Also, being both an equip spell strategy and a strategy that needs a specific named monster on board for their effects to be alive, the Adventurer Token series has 2 major vulnerabilities. What that means is your opponent just has a lot more options for the type of interruption that they open. They don't need exactly Lightning Storm and Feather Duster, or Lightning Storm and Raigeki, or Raigeki and Sprite Smashers or something like that. They just need one to force you to use the Omni Negate, and then anything to destroy any of your back row. It's actually really annoying that your good protection on your token comes as a combination of 2 different cards, instead of it just being on Forest, or just being on Papillon. You need both Forest and Papillon, so if your opponent opens anything to force Griffin and a Cosmic Cyclone, you basically lose the game. Or if they just open Token Collector, that's also just a single hand trap that shuts down the entire strategy. And finally, even though the series can generate really good advantage over time, you really only get 1 monster search per turn. It would be awesome if there was a way to consistently get both of your level 7s on board in a single turn, in at least one of the traps. That would be a huge boost for the series. It would also be great if there was just another good way to get a token on board, another version of Rite of Armaseer that still generates you more advantage. Overall, I think this is a very cool set of cards, centered around a very interesting concept. Unfortunately, those cards just don't offer much more than the adventure engine. Hopefully it's not too long before they get some really cool support that brings them into the game as a deck on its own, but they really need more access to the cards that they have in the deck, and probably also some new cards to raise the ceiling of the deck. I'm not totally convinced that even if it had access to everything in a turn, that it would be a real meta contender. I think it definitely needs more power. The deck definitely does have room for its own in-series boss monster still, so that could be a good place to start. There's already that one guy from the artwork on Thunder Discharge. What's his deal? Where's he? He seems strong. He's got real boss monster energy, or maybe another field spell to go along with Draco back, or another equip spell field spell pairing that's even better than the ones that we already have. This is just a series with so much room for improvement without having to change the core identity of the series, and I think that's really cool. That means it's in a good place conceptually, it just needs more to work with. And that's it. That's the series. What do you think of it? Have you had any success playing some sort of mixed combo build, or even just playing it pure? What kind of support do you want to see it get in the future? Or have you been burned one too many times by them and just hope they all get eroded into normal monsters? I hope you liked the video, and again, I would really appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe and let me know what you thought in the comments. Hope you have a nice day.